Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. With any luck, you're all having an amazing day. We have an awful lot of news to get through in this particular video, but I want to start things out with Intel and their Xe line of discrete GPUs. Specifically, this is an update to a piece I covered a couple of days ago, actually, from Digital Trends. Digital Trends leaked several slides which pertained to Intel's discrete GPUs, particularly for the servers, and they basically claimed that we will be seeing up to a 4-tile configuration for Xe, and they said that that would mean that we would have up to 512 execution units. So just to be clear here, a tile is basically a chiplet. You can essentially say that those two things are interchangeable when it comes to Intel. But this was actually not quite correct. The tile number is apparently correct, but when it comes to the actual configuration of the GPU, this was incorrect, at least according to WCCF Tech. They claim that the 128 execution number is actually for the lower power GPU. So that would be, for example, a GPU which doesn't necessarily have a PCIe power connector, and it would be like a cheap one that you would throw in to a machine that was designed to play like esports titles, basically. So that's DG1. But the higher performance GPUs, the ones that would be designed for data center and for higher end gaming solutions, those would have GPUs with 512 execution units. So in a 4-tile configuration, that would mean we have 2,048 execution units, which is obviously way more. And this would mean that in reality that would be 16,384 cores, simply because of the way the execution units are broken down into separate, smaller processors. Of course, we don't know yet the final specifications of these GPUs, pricing, or exactly what the architecture will entail for gaming versus the data center, but it makes a lot more sense when you think about this, because it would also make much more sense in terms of the power consumption for the GPU. It would be kind of weird that only 512 execution units would equate to 500 watts when you think about it, given the 96 execution units that we've been seeing for the DG1. It would be kind of weird that it would suddenly go all the way up to 500 watts just for 512 execution units. And given the next generation consoles launch at the end of this year, and also particularly given there is a lot of competition from Nvidia at the moment, we expect them to start transitioning to 7nm, although quite frankly, what exactly RTX 30 will be is mysterious. They would actually get a lot of mileage from just shifting from 12nm down to 7nm with Turing, cranking in additional SMs, adjusting clock frequencies, and basically just kind of going from there. And arguably they could do that if RDNA 2 wasn't super duper competitive, but apparently RDNA 2 is shaping up to be really nice. That's what I'm hearing from multiple different people, assuming AMD can shift the damn things, because they're getting a lot of negative press at the moment thanks to the whole driver situation. We're curious how that ends up unfolding. But anyway, moving back to Intel, I suspect, and judging from what I've heard anyway through the grapevine, Intel want to compete, and they might actually sell the GPUs at the lowest price possible, just to get their foot in the door. And obviously it's also going to come down to how they're going to market them. Word for the grapevine is that they're not going to necessarily release the GPUs through the likes of Asus and Gigabyte and MSI, in other words through AIBs, but they're going to manufacture them, internally, which I don't necessarily have any issues with, assuming the coolers are up to snuff and they don't kind of limit you too much in terms of options. Either way, it's going to be really interesting, because when these GPUs launch, we can have this situation where the best value could be like a Ryzen I was going to say 3000 series, but let's just say a Ryzen 4900 and an Intel Xe GPU, which is it's literally just doing a complete, it's turning everything on the head. It doesn't make sense anymore. The world's going mad. So yeah, I'm going to be really interested to see exactly what happens with Intel and their GPUs. A very small update for Comet Lake as well. I'm going to throw this in as a bit of a bonus piece of news, and that is that X-Fastest have actually leaked a image of a 10900. It is the non-K derivative, and you can see yourself that the clock frequency for the base says 2.5 gigahertz, although it's an Intel Confidential. Whether this is a final retail sample chip is unknown. The reason that it could potentially not be is because, according to Informatical Zero, one of the slides they leaked around a month and a half-ish ago, they claim that the clock frequency of this chip is going to be 2.8 gigahertz. Furthermore, if we look at the actual chip itself, there's something rather interesting. If you compare it, it's to the left, just to be clear, versus a 9900 chip, you can clearly see there's a difference in the rear of the chip. The SMDs themselves look kind of like they're bifurcated, almost like in two separate sections on the rear of the 10900. What does that mean? Well, it could be a plethora of different things. It could be Intel getting ready for chiplets, which is of course what Rocket Lake is said to be. It's supposed to be two separate dies. Die 1 is the, CPU, and Die 2 is said to be a Generation 12 GPU with some number of execution units. I'm hearing different things. I'm hearing everything from 32 up to 96 for the iGPU. But when it comes to this particular thing, I wonder if it's also how they've done Comet Lake, or whether it's just kind of laying the foundation. As for the socket, it's a 1200 pin socket, and you can see yourself the dimensions of the chips are essentially identical, but there are some differences inherent to the socket. Basically, one of them is that it's got around 150 additional pins. Secondly, we have the fact that the pins, the layout themselves are a little bit different. So while the actual coolers should be interchangeable, assuming your cooler can handle this amount of heat, like the 10900K is said to be 125 watts. But other than that, the pins themselves are not interchangeable, the sockets themselves are not interchangeable, but the coolers will be able to be interchangeable. And now let's move over to the PlayStation 5, because there is a report floating around from Bloomberg that the PlayStation 5 is going to cost around $450 to manufacture. We'll get to the Xbox side of the equation in just a moment, I promise. So, put this into perspective, the PlayStation 4, when it first debuted, cost around $380 to manufacture, and then was of course sold for $399. But that wasn't Sony then making $20 per console, because, the shops want a cut of that money, plus other things like shipping and any consoles that were faulty. Basically, Sony were losing a small amount of money per system sold, not a super large amount, but a small amount per system sold. And of course they made up for this by getting people into their ecosystem, game sales, or PlayStation Network, and whatever else. So why is it the PlayStation 5 is costing so much cash? Well, apparently it comes down to three different factors. One being DRAM, the second being NAND, and the third is the actual cooler for the system. Let's tackle the DRAM and NAND first. Basically, there are so many different devices which are vying for the memory component, memory manufacturing Basically, there are so many different devices right now which are vying for DRAM and NAND, the cost is being pushed up. Not least of which, of course, is GDDR6 is also being used for things like graphics cards. So you've got that to also take into consideration. but NAND flash as well. Basically, all of this stuff comes together to up the demand of the components, which naturally pushes up the price. And then when it comes to the cooler, Sony are paying for an unusually expensive cooler for the PlayStation 5. And what we do know is the PlayStation 5's APU, the clock frequency of the GPU is cranked up to like 1.82 gigahertz. So depending on the form factor and the design of the case of the PlayStation 5, potentially Sony needs to go with a more extravagant cooler, simply to get the thermals of the system under control. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to know how the temperatures will compare to the Xbox Series X. The rumour is that the Xbox Series X has a wider design, more compute units, but runs at a slower clock speed, let's say 1700 MHz, whereas the PlayStation 5 runs at, let's say, 2 GHz, but with far fewer compute units. So the question is, how does the heat compare for those two different consoles? Well, honestly, it's really difficult to do an apples-to-apples comparison, because what we don't know is the architectural differences between the two GPUs inside the systems. So, until we can basically measure the consoles and actually have an understanding, a deeper understanding of what the custom work is from both manufacturers, it's very difficult to be like, well, the PlayStation 5 GPU is going to be like operating at this type of temperature, whereas the Xbox Series X is going to be cooler, or it's going to be warmer because it's got more compute units. So what about the Xbox? What about the pricing of the Xbox Series X? Well, most likely it's going to cost between $460 to $520 to manufacture. That's according to Daniel Ahmed, who is a well-known journalist and industry insider. He's also heard, according to his information anyway, that the PlayStation 5 is probably going to cost around $450, but the Xbox Series X could cost up to $520. I would also advocate to not really do an apples-to-apples comparison here, because even if you take the $460 as a minimum, and quite honestly, I'm going to guess it's going to cost Microsoft more than that, you can't then say, well, the APU of the Xbox Series X is comparable to manufacturer. You can't then say, well, there's only like $10, $20, $30 price difference between the two consoles, so the specifications of the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 must be really close to one another. From what we understand, the APU of the Xbox Series X is around 100 mm² bigger than the PlayStation 5. I'm actually hearing different things. Some people are telling me it's a bigger difference than that. Other people are telling me it's a smaller difference than that. So I'm going to split the difference for this video and just say it's 100 mm². The thing is, though, the cost of the APU itself is not the entire cost of the console. Indeed, depending on the console and the generation, the APU, which could be the CPU and GPU if they're separate for different consoles, but I'm just going to say the APU, for just being generic in this video, could be only a third of the cost of the system. You also need to take into consideration the cost of DRAM, RAM, the drive itself, the Blu-ray drive, assuming it's applicable to the generation of console. It looks like both Sony and Microsoft have confirmed a Blu-ray drive for their system, the case, the cooler, and, well, just about everything else internal in the system. So all of this stuff comes together to reach the final price point. And I do believe that Microsoft most likely will also not have such an expensive SSD. I'm hearing that Microsoft's SSD is only generation 3, whereas Sony is generation 4, so Sony most likely have a smaller APU, smaller, less powerful APU, but they have a much faster SSD. And I'm also hearing conflicting information for the RAM configuration of both systems. I'm hearing that the PlayStation 5 has 16GB of GDDR6 memory with up to 512GB per second of bandwidth, although there were some internal documents which showed 448GB per second, but from everything I've been told more recently, the PlayStation 5 has 512GB per second, but for the Xbox Series X, I've been told different configurations as well. Some reports of 16GB, But I've also been told 20GB and 24GB for the Xbox Series X as well. So honestly, there are so many different moving parts to this system and the pricing. It's going to be really interesting to see what they decide to do, because apparently Sony are going to be waiting for Microsoft to kind of make the first move in terms of the pricing. They basically said that out loud when they were commenting on what they wanted to do regarding the price of the PlayStation 5 when they were pressed. I believe that came into the news last week. But according to the source that was speaking to Bloomberg, they've basically echoed that Sony at the moment are kind of playing a wait-and-see game. There are a couple of questions on the Microsoft equation. One, does Xbox Series S exist? I'm personally leaning towards no, because Phil Spencer basically denied that they're pursuing that. Then again, there are some reports that it still exists, so I guess we can say maybe, but probably no if Spencer said it doesn't exist. So maybe one of the reasons that Microsoft are being so adamant with the compatibility pledge and basically saying that we're going to get games on the Xbox One series, for example Halo Infinite, is because they know in their heart there's a really good chance that the system is going to be kind of expensive. Let's take a worse scenario for a moment and say that the system costs $520 for Microsoft to produce. Well, when you start taking other things into account, like retailer costs and shipping, let's, for a nice round figure, say that that's probably going to be $550. It's a lot of money. I think Sony and Microsoft will probably eat some of the costs for this generation, so I suspect Microsoft may decide to sell the Xbox Series X at like $499, which was still a hefty chunk of change. So I think that may be one of the reasons that Microsoft are kind of playing it the way they are for the next generation. It's going to be really interesting now. I really want to know the final specs of these systems, and I'm super curious to see what the strategy is going in terms of the pricing. And one final piece of news, and this does concern the PlayStation 5, there is a report going around that the PlayStation 5 will be able to run PS3 games without a patch. Apparently, there was a discussion between two Malaysian guys. They are apparently developers. One of them actually works at a Sony game studio. And apparently, there was talk that Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance will be able to run on the PlayStation 5 without a patch to run the title. So it will basically just be a case of you throw the disc into the system and it will load, or I guess if you're playing it digitally, much the same thing. So it would basically mean that Sony are taking a kind of similar route to what we saw with Microsoft, where you can of course run Xbox 360 games on the Xbox One. I would of course take this with lots and lots and lots of salt, but this is not the first time that we've heard rumours that the PlayStation 5 will be backwards compatible with previous PlayStation systems. Honestly, I think the PlayStation 1 and 2 are very easy for Sony to do. They could do that in software without too much of difficulty, simply by even software emulation, if they really wanted to just brute force it. As I've said previously, you can run PlayStation 1 games on a turnip at this point. And PlayStation 2 games aren't particularly difficult either, to be really honest. Just for the sake of argument, I do have a PlayStation 2 and I've got lots of PS2 games, and one of the games I'm playing at the moment is actually Resident Evil Code Veronica, and I actually have a Intel i7-4770K, which is kind of an older machine. It's only got 4 processor cores, 8 threads, and that's with a GTX 1080. And I'm running at like 4 or 8 times, I can't remember now, the internal rendered resolution with lots and lots of MSAA and everything else applied, and just lots of hacks to make the game just look a lot better, and kind of even hacked it to widescreen, playing through it at the moment and getting like max frame rate. And the PlayStation 5 CPU is going to be considerably faster than that. And I do have faster processors available to me. I've got like a 3700X, I've got a 9900K, But it just so happens that the emulator on this particular machine is all set up and I can't be bothered to transfer configuration files because, well, I just want to play and I'm feeling really lazy, to be really honest with you. But yeah, so I think software emulation of PS2 will be pretty simple. So it will be interesting though. I would love to see how they have managed to do PS3 games. We can also see PCSX 3, which is a PS3 emulator for, well, PC. And the emulation on that is getting pretty amazing, quite honestly. You can actually run some games at 60 FPS, and I believe you can even do that with like Demon Souls. You can, of course, then start doing things like post-process injection with like sweet effects and all this other stuff, and you can get reshade going. But anyway, I'm getting way off topic now, but hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you did, then the normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.